This is expertly weird, where even history's oddest details become a soft, cozy story. Tonight, we're not diving into tales of heroism or grand architecture. We're stepping into something far more intimate, far more universal, and infinitely more uncomfortable to discuss at dinner parties. We're talking about one of humanity's most basic needs, one that every single person throughout history has faced, yet somehow remains shrouded in mystery and awkward silence. The simple, unavoidable question: what did people do before toilet paper existed? If this kind of historically grounded storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you some strange comfort. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. There's something oddly reassuring about knowing we're all contemplating the same ancient human struggles together, separated by centuries, but united by biology. So settle in, perhaps with a cup of tea, and let's journey back through time to explore one of civilization's most overlooked innovations. Because before those soft perforated sheets became a bathroom staple, our ancestors had to get remarkably creative about personal hygiene. And their solutions were as varied as they were ingenious, disgusting, and occasionally dangerous. Picture this. You're living in ancient Rome, around 100 CE. The empire is at its height, aqueducts are delivering fresh water to magnificent cities, gladiators are battling in the Colosseum, and you've just finished a hearty meal of garum-soaked bread and wine. Nature calls, as it inevitably does. You make your way to the public latrine, a communal affair where rows of marble seats with holes cut into them line the walls. Privacy is a foreign concept here. You sit shoulder to shoulder with fellow citizens, conducting business while discussing politics, trade, or the latest chariot races. But here's where it gets interesting. When the time comes to clean yourself, you don't reach for a roll of charmin. Instead, you grab what Romans called a tersorium, essentially a sponge attached to a wooden stick. This wasn't your personal sponge, mind you. This was the communal cleaning device, shared among all the users of that particular latrine. The sponge would be rinsed in a bucket of salt water or vinegar between uses, though one has to wonder just how thorough that cleaning really was. The Romans, despite their engineering marvels and sophisticated society, seemed remarkably comfortable with this arrangement. Archaeological evidence from sites like Housestead's Roman fort along Hadrian's Wall reveals these communal latrines with their characteristic channels running beneath the seats, carrying waste away with flowing water. The channels in front of the seats, where the sponge sticks were cleaned, still bear witness to this ancient system of shared hygiene. But Romans weren't alone in their creative solutions to this fundamental human need. Travel east to ancient China, and you'll discover an entirely different approach. The wealthy classes had access to what might be considered the world's first luxury toilet paper, made from soft cloth or even silk for the most affluent. However, the common people relied on whatever materials were at hand: smooth stones, pieces of bamboo, or corn cobs when available. Chinese historical records from the 6th century describe the use of paper for hygiene purposes among the wealthy. But this was centuries before such luxury would spread to other parts of the world. The Tang dynasty saw the development of more refined paper products specifically for personal use, though these remained expensive and largely limited to the upper classes. In medieval Europe, the situation was quite different and considerably more varied depending on your social status. The wealthy might use soft cloths, wool or linen scraps, often discarded after use or carefully washed and reused. These materials were precious commodities, so waste was minimal. Nobles sometimes employed what were essentially personal hygiene attendants, whose duties included managing these intimate aspects of daily life. The common folk, however, had to be far more resourceful. They relied heavily on what nature provided: leaves, moss, smooth stones, or even corn cobs in regions where corn was grown. The choice of leaves was crucial. Certain plants were preferred for their softness and lack of irritating properties. Mullein, known for its large, soft leaves, was particularly prized in many regions. Lamb's ear, with its velvety texture, was another favourite. But perhaps no solution was as ingenious as what developed in rural communities across various cultures: the gomph stick. This was essentially a small smooth stick, often carved from soft wood and sometimes passed down through families. The stick would be scraped clean after each use and stored in a designated spot. While this might seem primitive to modern sensibilities, it was actually quite practical and hygienic when properly maintained. In ancient Greece, the approach varied significantly by region and social class. The wealthy often used pieces of ceramic called pessoi, which were smooth pottery shards specifically created for this purpose. These weren't random broken pieces, but carefully crafted items with smooth edges and ergonomic shapes. Archaeological digs have uncovered collections of these pessoi in ancient Greek homes, often decorated with inscriptions or simple designs. The Greeks also pioneered the use of what they called xylospongium, similar to the Roman tersorium, but often more personalized. Wealthy Greek households might have individual sponges rather than shared communal ones, and these would be maintained by household slaves whose duties included keeping such items clean and ready for use. Moving to ancient Egypt, we find yet another fascinating approach. The Egyptians, with their obsession with cleanliness and the afterlife, developed sophisticated hygiene practices that included specific rituals around personal cleansing. They used a combination of water, natron salt, and soft cloths. The wealthy had access to fine linen cloths, while commoners made do with coarser materials or natural alternatives. Egyptian tomb paintings and hieroglyphics occasionally reference these practices, though always in euphemistic terms. The culture's emphasis on purity and cleanliness extended to all aspects of daily life, and personal hygiene was considered not just practical, but spiritually important. In ancient Japan, the approach was deeply influenced by the culture's relationship with nature and cleanliness. The Japanese developed a system using what they called chugi, which were thin wooden sticks, similar to chopsticks, but specifically designed for hygiene purposes. These were often used in combination with water and were considered more hygienic than many alternatives used elsewhere in the world. The Japanese also pioneered the use of special paper called washi for this purpose among the upper classes, centuries before toilet paper became common in the West. This handmade paper was soft, absorbent, and represented a significant advancement in personal hygiene technology. In the Americas, indigenous peoples developed their own sophisticated solutions long before European contact. Native American tribes used a variety of natural materials depending on their geographic location and available resources. Soft grasses, moss, smooth stones, corn cobs, and specially selected leaves were all common choices. The Mayans and Aztecs had particularly advanced approaches to personal hygiene, incorporating their extensive knowledge of local flora. They identified specific plants whose leaves were not only soft, but also had natural antibacterial properties. Some of these plants are still used in traditional medicine today for their healing and cleansing properties. What's remarkable about all these ancient solutions is how they reflect the ingenuity and adaptability of human beings when faced with universal needs. Each culture developed methods that worked within their environment, using available materials and incorporating their understanding of hygiene and health. The transition from these various natural and improvised methods to something resembling modern toilet paper was gradual and uneven across different parts of the world. In many regions, traditional methods persisted well into the modern era, not necessarily because better alternatives weren't known, but because they were perfectly adequate for the culture's needs and values. Understanding these historical practices gives us insight not just into daily life in ancient times, but into how human societies have always found ways to maintain dignity and cleanliness regardless of technological limitations. These weren't crude or barbaric practices, but thoughtful solutions developed over generations of human experience. The story of how we got from sponge sticks and smooth stones to the soft, multiply luxury we take for granted today, is a testament to human innovation and the relentless march of technological progress. But it's also a reminder that for thousands of years, our ancestors managed quite well with what they had, developing systems that were often more sophisticated and environmentally conscious than we might initially assume. As we continue this journey through the history of human hygiene, we'll discover that the path to modern toilet paper wasn't just about technological advancement. It was about changing attitudes toward privacy, cleanliness, and what constituted acceptable standards of living. The rise of what we might recognize as the first true toilet paper can be traced to China during the Tang dynasty around the 8th century. But this wasn't the mass-produced commodity we know today. It was a luxury item, carefully crafted and reserved for the imperial court and the wealthiest merchants. The paper was often perfumed, sometimes even decorated with delicate patterns, transforming a mundane necessity into something approaching art. Chinese emperors of the Yuan dynasty took this concept even further. Historical records describe toilet paper manufactured specifically for the imperial family that was not only soft and absorbent, but also infused with medicinal herbs believed to promote health and ward off evil spirits. Each sheet was approximately 2 feet by 3 feet, far larger than anything we use today, and was considered so precious that its production was carefully monitored by court officials. But while China was pioneering paper-based solutions, the rest of the world remained firmly committed to their traditional methods. In medieval Europe, the concept of paper for personal hygiene was virtually unknown. Instead, the period saw the refinement of existing techniques and the development of some truly creative alternatives. Castle life in medieval England presents us with particularly fascinating insights into how the upper classes managed their personal needs. The wealthy constructed elaborate private chambers called guardrobes, essentially early bathrooms built into castle walls with chutes that dropped waste directly into moats or rivers below. But the cleaning materials used in these private sanctuaries were far from primitive. Noble families employed what were known as gong farmers, specialized servants whose duties included maintaining supplies of soft fabrics for personal use. These might include discarded silk from worn clothing, fine wool scraps, or specially prepared linen cloths. The fabrics were often scented with herbs like lavender or rosemary, both for pleasant fragrance and for their believed antibacterial properties. The concept of reusable cleaning cloths was actually quite sophisticated in medieval households. Designated servants would collect, wash, and prepare these materials using techniques that involved boiling with lye soap and herbs. The cloths were then carefully dried and stored in cedar chests to prevent moths and maintain freshness. It was a system that required considerable household management, but provided a level of comfort and cleanliness that rivaled later innovations. For the common people of medieval Europe, however, such luxuries were unimaginable. They continued to rely on the bounty of nature, but with increasingly sophisticated knowledge of which materials worked best. Rural communities developed extensive oral traditions around the selection and preparation of natural cleaning materials. Hay was a common choice, but not just any hay. Experienced users knew to select the softest, most golden portions, avoiding anything too coarse or containing thistles. The hay would be bundled and sometimes stored in dry places for months, allowing it to achieve the perfect texture. Similarly, moss selection became something of an art form. Sphagnum moss, found in boggy areas, was particularly prized for its absorbent qualities and natural antiseptic properties. In regions where sheep were common, wool became the material of choice. Not the coarse outer wool, but the soft undercoat that was often considered too fine for textile production. This wool would be carefully cleaned, carded, and formed into small pads that could be used once and then composted. It was renewable, effective, and readily available in pastoral communities. The Vikings, with their extensive travels and trading networks, encountered and adopted various hygiene practices from across the known world. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements reveals an interesting combination of techniques. They used everything from soft leather scraps to specially prepared seaweed, depending on what was available in their current location. Viking longships even carried supplies of cleaned wool and moss, specifically for personal hygiene during long voyages. One of the most ingenious solutions developed during this period was the use of what historians call hygiene stones. These weren't random rocks picked up from the ground, but carefully selected and prepared stones with specific qualities. They needed to be smooth, non-porous, and of the right size and shape for effective use. Some communities even developed techniques for polishing these stones to achieve the perfect surface texture. In coastal communities, shells became the preferred alternative. Mussel shells, when properly cleaned and with their edges carefully smoothed, provided an effective and naturally curved cleaning surface. These shells would be collected during low tide, prepared by removing any sharp edges, and then stored in clean sand to maintain their condition. The Islamic world during the medieval period developed perhaps the most sophisticated approach to personal hygiene of any contemporary civilization. Islamic law, or Sharia, contains specific guidelines about cleanliness and personal hygiene that influence daily practices across the Muslim world. The concept of istinja, the Islamic practice of cleansing after using the toilet, involves specific techniques and materials. Water was always the preferred cleaning method in Islamic cultures, but when water was scarce, Muslims developed alternatives that adhered to religious principles while maintaining effectiveness. Smooth stones known as ahjar were commonly used, but these had to meet specific criteria. They couldn't be too small, too large, or have any rough edges. Most importantly, they had to be ritually clean and unused for any other purpose. Islamic scholars even wrote detailed treatises on proper hygiene techniques and materials. These texts, preserved in medieval libraries from Baghdad to Cordoba, reveal a level of attention to personal cleanliness that wouldn't be matched in Europe for several centuries. The use of perfumed water, soft cloths, and natural cleaning agents was not just practical, but considered obligation. In medieval religious Islamic Spain, the confluence of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish cultures created unique approaches to personal hygiene. The famous public baths of cities like Cordoba and Granada weren't just places for washing, but centers of social life where hygiene practices were shared and refined across cultural boundaries. These bathhouses maintained supplies of soft towels, cleaning cloths, and natural scrubbing materials that represented the height of medieval hygiene technology. The Crusades, despite their violent nature, became unexpected vectors for the transmission of hygiene knowledge. European crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought back not just stories of battle, but also exposure to Islamic and Byzantine hygiene practices. This cultural exchange slowly began to influence European approaches to personal cleanliness. Byzantine Constantinople, the great city that bridged Europe and Asia, developed its own unique solutions. The Byzantines combined Roman engineering with Eastern luxury, creating elaborate private bathrooms in wealthy homes that featured not just running water, but also supplies of soft fabrics, perfumed oils, and cleaning implements that represented centuries of refinement. But perhaps nowhere was the contrast between rich and poor more stark than in the growing cities of medieval Europe. In places like London, Paris, and Venice, the wealthy lived in relative comfort with access to soft materials and private facilities, while the urban poor crowded into tenements where privacy was non-existent and cleaning materials were whatever could be scavenged from the streets. City life created entirely new challenges for personal hygiene. Unlike rural communities where natural materials were readily available, urban dwellers had to purchase or trade for cleaning supplies. This led to the development of some of the earliest commercial markets for hygiene products. Street vendors sold bundles of soft rags. Merchants imported exotic materials like silk scraps from distant lands, and enterprising individuals collected and cleaned discarded fabrics for resale. The guild system that dominated medieval commerce even extended to hygiene-related trades. There were guilds for rag collectors, cloth preparers, and even specialists who cleaned and maintained the communal facilities in larger cities. These weren't glamorous professions, but they were essential to urban life, and surprisingly well regulated. As we move into the later medieval period and approach the Renaissance, we begin to see the first stirrings of the innovations that would eventually lead to modern toilet paper. But the journey from medieval ingenuity to mass-produced convenience would take several more centuries and involve changes in technology, society, and attitudes toward privacy and cleanliness that would reshape the very foundations of daily life. Human ingenuity in addressing this most basic need reveals something profound about our species. Faced with a universal challenge, different cultures developed solutions that reflected their values, resources, and understanding of health and cleanliness. None of these approaches were inferior to others, merely different responses to the same fundamental human requirement. The Renaissance brought with it a revolution in thinking about cleanliness, privacy, and what constituted civilized behavior. As European cities grew wealthier and more sophisticated, the old communal approaches to personal hygiene began to seem crude and undignified. The emerging merchant classes demanded privacy and comfort that their newfound wealth could provide. In Italy, the birthplace of Renaissance culture, wealthy families began constructing elaborate private chambers dedicated solely to personal needs. These weren't the crude garderobes of medieval castles, but carefully designed rooms with imported marble seats, running water from advanced plumbing systems, and supplies of the finest materials available. Venetian merchants, enriched by trade with the East, imported silk scraps and fine cotton cloths specifically for personal use. The Medici family of Florence, perhaps the most famous patrons of Renaissance art and culture, maintained household inventories that included detailed lists of hygiene supplies. These records reveal purchases of specially woven linen cloths, imported perfumed oils, and even experimental papers made from cotton and linen fibers. The Renaissance obsession with refinement extended to every aspect of daily life, including the most private moments. But it was in the monasteries and scriptoriums of Renaissance Europe that perhaps the most significant developments occurred. Monks who spent their days copying manuscripts and creating illuminated texts generated enormous quantities of waste parchment and paper. These scraps, unsuitable for writing but still soft and absorbent, found a new purpose in monastery latrines. The Benedictine monasteries of France and Germany began systematically collecting these paper scraps, sorting them by quality and texture. The finest scraps were reserved for the abbot and senior monks, while coarser materials served the general monastic community. This represented one of the earliest systematic uses of paper-like materials for personal hygiene in Europe. Meanwhile, the printing revolution initiated by Gutenberg created an unexpected byproduct. The early printing process was messy and imperfect, generating large quantities of misprinted pages and paper waste. Printers, ever practical, began selling these waste materials to households for various purposes, including personal hygiene. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers that the same technology spreading literacy and knowledge was also providing material for humanity's most basic needs. In Spain, the influence of centuries of Islamic rule had left lasting impacts on hygiene practices. Spanish households, particularly in the south, maintained traditions of water-based cleansing combined with soft cloth materials. The Spanish also developed a unique approach using specially prepared cork bark, which was harvested, cleaned, and shaped into smooth curved pieces that were surprisingly effective and comfortable. The age of exploration brought European colonizers into contact with indigenous hygiene practices around the world, leading to fascinating cultural exchanges. Spanish conquistadors in the Americas encountered Aztec and Inca practices that often surpassed European standards of cleanliness. The Incas, with their sophisticated understanding of textiles, used incredibly soft alpaca wool for personal hygiene among the elite, while common people employed carefully selected plant materials. In North America, European colonists learned from Native American tribes about the properties of various local plants. Mullein leaves, corn silk, and certain types of moss became standard materials in colonial households. The soft inner bark of basswood trees, when properly prepared, provided another effective natural alternative that many colonists preferred to the rough fabrics they had brought from Europe. The Dutch colonies in the Americas developed particularly innovative approaches to hygiene materials. Dutch settlers, with their tradition of maritime trading, had access to materials from around the world. They imported soft cotton from their Caribbean plantations, fine paper from their Asian trading posts, and combined these with local materials to create hybrid solutions that represented the best of multiple worlds. French colonists in Louisiana and Canada developed their own unique approaches, influenced by both their European heritage and the practical realities of frontier life. They learned from local Native American tribes about the use of Spanish moss, which grew abundantly in the bayous and could be harvested, cleaned and dried to create surprisingly effective hygiene material. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was the gradual shift in attitudes toward privacy and personal space. The medieval communal approach to bodily functions was increasingly seen as uncivilized and unhealthy. Wealthy families began constructing private facilities not just for comfort, but as symbols of their social status and refinement. The emerging middle classes of the 17th and 18th centuries created a market demand for hygiene products that enterprising merchants were quick to fill. In London, specialized shops began selling bundles of soft rags, imported papers, and even early versions of what might be recognized as toilet tissue. These weren't mass-produced items, but carefully prepared materials sold to households that could afford such luxuries. The growth of the textile industry created new opportunities for hygiene innovation. Cotton mills in England began producing specific grades of soft cloth intended for personal use. These weren't the fine fabrics destined for clothing, but deliberately manufactured materials optimized for absorbency and comfort. The waste materials from silk production, previously discarded, found new markets as luxury hygiene products. In colonial America, the combination of Puritan values, emphasizing cleanliness, and practical frontier ingenuity led to some remarkable innovations. American households developed sophisticated systems for preparing and maintaining hygiene materials. They learned to process corn husks into soft, absorbent pads, to prepare cattail fluff as a cotton substitute, and to create reusable cloth systems that could be efficiently cleaned and maintained. The Shakers, a religious community known for their practical innovations, developed particularly advanced approaches to personal hygiene. Their communities maintained dedicated workshops for preparing hygiene materials, using techniques that maximized both effectiveness and economy. Shaker-produced hygiene supplies were so well regarded that they became trade items with neighboring communities. But it was the growing understanding of disease transmission that began to drive real change in hygiene practices. The periodic cholera outbreaks that swept through European and American cities in the 18th and 19th centuries highlighted the connection between sanitation and health. Medical authorities began recommending specific materials and practices for personal hygiene, moving beyond tradition and superstition toward evidence-based approaches. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to reshape every aspect of daily life, and personal hygiene was no exception. The same mechanical innovations that were transforming textile production, paper manufacturing, and chemical processing would soon be applied to the challenge of creating better, cheaper, and more widely available hygiene products. Steam-powered mills could process larger quantities of raw materials more efficiently than ever before. Chemical innovations allowed for better bleaching and softening of papers and fabrics. Transportation improvements meant that materials could be moved from production centres to markets across vast distances. All the pieces were falling into place for a revolution in personal hygiene that would transform this most basic human need from a matter of individual ingenuity into a mass-produced commodity. Yet even as these industrial changes gathered momentum, traditional methods persisted in many parts of the world. Rural communities continued to rely on natural materials, not because better alternatives weren't available, but because their traditional methods were perfectly adequate for their needs and values. The transition from traditional to modern hygiene practices would be gradual and uneven, reflecting broader patterns of social and economic change. The story of human hygiene reveals something fundamental about our species' capacity for adaptation and innovation. Faced with a universal challenge, humans across cultures and centuries developed solutions that reflected their environment, resources, and values. None of these approaches were inherently superior to others, merely different responses to the same basic need. As we approach the era of mass-produced toilet paper, we're not witnessing the triumph of civilization over barbarism, but rather the latest chapter in humanity's ongoing relationship with comfort, cleanliness, and dignity. The dawn of the Industrial Revolution marked a turning point not just in manufacturing and transportation, but in the most intimate aspects of human existence. As steam engines belched smoke across the landscapes of Europe and America, and factory whistles began to regulate the rhythm of daily life, even something as personal as bathroom habits was about to be transformed by the relentless march of mechanization. In the textile mills of Manchester and Birmingham, the constant hum of machinery produced not just fine fabrics for the growing middle class, but mountains of waste material that previous generations would have simply discarded. Cotton fibers too short for spinning, linen scraps deemed unsuitable for weaving, and silk remnants from luxury production all accumulated in factory corners. Enterprising mill owners, ever alert to new revenue streams, began sorting and processing these waste materials into something entirely new. The first commercial toilet tissues weren't born from a grand vision of improved hygiene, but from industrial pragmatism. Factory managers discovered that their textile waste, when properly cleaned, bleached, and softened, could be sold to urban households as an alternative to the increasingly expensive imported cleaning cloths that the wealthy preferred. It was capitalism solving a problem that hadn't quite recognized itself as a problem yet. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the newspaper industry. The steam-powered printing presses that were revolutionizing mass communication also generated enormous quantities of waste paper. Misprints, damaged sheets, and offcuts from the trimming process created a steady stream of relatively soft paper that was too damaged for reading, but perfect for other purposes. Publishers in London and New York began selling these waste materials to households, initially marketing them simply as soft paper, without explicitly stating their intended use. Victorian sensibilities, after all, didn't encourage direct discussion of bathroom habits, even in commercial contexts. The papers were sold in neat bundles, often with euphemistic labels like necessity papers or private papers. The quality varied enormously depending on the source. Newspapers printed on cheap wood pulp paper were rough and absorbent, but hardly luxurious. However, the waste from books and higher quality publications printed on cotton-based papers provided a much softer and more comfortable experience. Wealthy households quickly learned to specify their preferences, creating an early market segmentation that would persist for generations. In America, the Sears catalog became an unintended pioneer in bathroom tissue. The thick, soft paper used for the catalog's pages, combined with its eventual obsolescence when new editions arrived, made it a natural choice for frontier families. The catalog's journey from mailbox to outhouse became so common that it entered American folklore, representing the practical ingenuity of rural life. But it was Joseph Gaiety who first recognized the commercial potential of purpose-made toilet paper. In 1857, this New York entrepreneur began manufacturing what he called Gaiety's medicated paper, the first toilet paper specifically designed and marketed for personal hygiene. Each sheet was infused with aloe and bore Gaiety's name as a watermark. perhaps history's first example of bathroom branding. Gaiety's innovation wasn't just in the product itself, but in his marketing approach. He emphasized the health benefits of his medicated paper, claiming it could prevent hemorrhoids and other ailments supposedly caused by the rough materials most people were using. His advertisements, carefully worded to maintain Victorian propriety, promised a perfectly pure article for the toilet and for the prevention of piles. The product was expensive, retailing for 50 cents per pack of 500 sheets at a time when newspapers cost just a few pennies. This pricing reflected both the novelty of the concept and the costs of small-scale production. Gaiety's paper found a market among the urban wealthy, but remained too expensive for widespread adoption. Meanwhile, in hotels and public facilities across American cities, a different approach was emerging. Hotel proprietors, faced with the challenge of providing hygiene materials for diverse clientele, began purchasing waste paper in bulk and cutting it into uniform sheets. These were stored in wooden boxes or dispensers, creating some of the first systematic approaches to providing toilet paper in commercial settings. The Civil War created unexpected opportunities for innovation in personal hygiene. Military quartermasters, responsible for supplying hundreds of thousands of soldiers, couldn't rely on traditional methods like leaves or corn cobs. They began purchasing waste paper and cloth materials in enormous quantities, creating economies of scale that drove down costs and improved quality. Soldiers returning from the war brought with them exposure to manufactured hygiene products that many had never encountered in their rural communities. This created a generation of Americans who had experienced alternatives to traditional methods and were willing to pay for convenience and comfort. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, revolutionized the distribution of manufactured goods across America. Products that had previously been limited to major cities could now reach frontier towns and rural communities. Toilet paper manufacturers began shipping their products westward, often as part of larger shipments of household goods. In the lumber camps of the Pacific Northwest and the mining towns of Colorado and Nevada, manufactured toilet paper found ready markets among workers who had cash wages and limited access to traditional natural materials. These rough-and-tumble communities, despite their frontier reputation, often had surprisingly sophisticated consumer preferences when it came to personal comfort. The development of wood pulp paper processing in the 1870s marked another crucial milestone. Previous paper production had relied heavily on cotton and linen rags, making it expensive and limited in quantity. Wood pulp processing allowed for mass production of paper at dramatically lower costs, making toilet paper economically viable for broader segments of society. The Scott Paper Company, founded in Philadelphia in 1879, became one of the first businesses to focus specifically on toilet paper production. The Scott brothers, Arthur and Irvin, recognized that the key to success lay not just in producing toilet paper, but in making it socially acceptable to purchase and use. Their marketing campaigns carefully balanced the need to inform consumers about their product with the Victorian requirement for discretion about bodily functions. Scott's innovations included perforated rolls, making it easier to tear off appropriate amounts, and the development of softer paper grades that competed directly with the cloth materials that wealthy households preferred. They also pioneered the concept of brand loyalty in bathroom products, encouraging customers to ask specifically for Scott tissue rather than accepting generic alternatives. The company's success spawned competitors across America. Kimberly-Clark, originally a lumber company, diversified into paper products and began producing toilet paper in their Wisconsin mills. Charmin, founded in 1928, focused specifically on softness, using the slogan, "Please don't squeeze the Charmin," to emphasize their product's superior texture. But perhaps the most significant change wasn't in the products themselves, but in the social attitudes surrounding them. The late 19th century saw a gradual shift from communal to private approaches to personal hygiene. Indoor plumbing became more common in urban areas, creating private spaces where individuals could attend to personal needs without the social pressures of communal facilities. This privacy revolution created new market opportunities for toilet paper manufacturers. Households with private bathrooms were willing to pay premium prices for products that enhanced comfort and cleanliness in their personal spaces. The bathroom began its transformation from a purely functional space to something approaching a private sanctuary. The development of bathroom tissue also reflected broader changes in American society. The growing middle class had both the disposable income to purchase manufactured hygiene products and the social aspirations that made such purchases desirable. Toilet paper became a marker of social status, distinguishing those who could afford modern conveniences from those who still relied on traditional methods. Women's magazines began featuring advertisements for toilet paper, though always with carefully euphemistic language. These advertisements emphasized cleanliness, health, and modernity, appealing to middle-class desires for respectability and progress. The products were positioned not as luxuries, but as necessities for proper household management. The Spanish-American War of 1898 created another surge in demand for manufactured hygiene products. Military procurement officers, having learned lessons from the Civil War, included toilet paper in their supply contracts from the beginning. This military demand helped stabilize the growing toilet paper industry and encouraged further innovation in production techniques. By the dawn of the 20th century, toilet paper had evolved from an expensive novelty to a standard household item in urban America. Rural communities still largely relied on traditional methods, but even there, the Sears catalogue and other mail-order sources were making manufactured alternatives increasingly available. The transition wasn't complete, and it wasn't uniform across all segments of society. Economic class, geographic location, and cultural background all influenced how quickly individuals and communities adopted manufactured toilet paper. But the foundation had been laid for what would become one of the most ubiquitous consumer products in human history. This industrial transformation of such an intimate aspect of human experience reveals something profound about the nature of progress itself. Innovation often emerges not from grand visions but from practical solutions to everyday problems. The entrepreneurs who pioneered the toilet paper industry weren't trying to revolutionize human civilization. They were simply trying to make a profit by solving a problem that everyone had but few wanted to discuss openly. Yet in solving that problem, they fundamentally changed the relationship between humans and one of their most basic needs. What had once been a matter of individual resourcefulness and adaptation to local conditions became increasingly standardized, commercialized, and divorced from natural cycles and materials. The soft white sheets that we take for granted today represent not just technological progress, but a fundamental shift in how humans relate to their own bodies and their environment. The early 20th century brought with it a wave of social changes that would forever alter how Americans thought about cleanliness, health, and personal care. The progressive era's emphasis on public health and sanitation created an environment where manufactured hygiene products weren't just conveniences, but moral imperatives. Reformers preached that cleanliness was indeed next to godliness, and toilet paper manufacturers were more than happy to provide the tools for salvation. World War I accelerated these changes in ways no one could have predicted. Military medical officers, having studied disease transmission in crowded training camps, began emphasizing personal hygiene as a matter of national security. Soldiers who maintained proper sanitation were less likely to fall ill, making them more effective fighting forces. The government began including toilet paper in standard military rations, not as a luxury, but as essential equipment. When these doughboys returned home from the trenches of France, they brought with them habits formed under military discipline. Men who had grown up using corn cobs and catalogue pages now expected the soft, manufactured paper they'd been provided in the army. Their wives and families, eager to provide comfort to returning heroes, created a domestic market that toilet paper companies rushed to fill. The economic boom of the 1920s transformed toilet paper from a middle-class convenience into something approaching a universal necessity. Mass production techniques developed during the war allowed manufacturers to produce higher quality products at lower costs. The rise of chain stores like Woolworths and A&P created distribution networks that could deliver toilet paper to even small towns across America. But it was the advertising revolution of the 20s that truly cemented toilet paper's place in American life. Madison Avenue discovered that even the most intimate products could be sold if marketed with sufficient creativity and discretion. Advertisements began appearing in popular magazines, though always with careful attention to propriety. Charmin's famous "Don't Squeeze the Charmin" campaign transformed a utilitarian product into something with personality and brand recognition. The development of coloured and patterned toilet papers reflected the era's embrace of consumer choice and personal expression. No longer was toilet paper simply white and functional. Manufacturers offered pink, blue and yellow varieties, often with decorative patterns or embossed designs. Bathrooms began to be decorated around toilet paper colours, turning functional spaces into expressions of personal taste. The Great Depression initially threatened this growing industry, as families faced impossible choices between necessities and conveniences. Many Americans returned to traditional methods, using newspaper, catalogue pages, or whatever materials they could find. But toilet paper manufacturers adapted, developing economy grades and smaller package sizes that made their products accessible even to struggling families. New Deal programs that brought electricity and indoor plumbing to rural America created entirely new markets for toilet paper companies. Farm families who had relied on outhouses and traditional materials suddenly found themselves with indoor bathrooms and the social expectations that came with modern conveniences. The Rural Electrification Administration didn't just bring lights to farmhouses, it brought the cultural pressure to use manufactured hygiene products. World War II created both challenges and opportunities for the toilet paper industry. Raw material rationing forced manufacturers to develop new production techniques using recycled materials and alternative fibers. Government contracts for military supplies guaranteed steady demand, but civilian rationing meant that toilet paper became a precious commodity on the home front. The war also accelerated research into paper chemistry and manufacturing processes. Scientists working on military applications discovered new ways to make paper softer, stronger, and more absorbent. These innovations, originally developed for parachutes and medical supplies, found their way into civilian toilet paper production after the war ended. The post-war economic boom of the 1950s ushered in the golden age of toilet paper marketing. Television advertising allowed manufacturers to reach consumers in their homes with messages about comfort, cleanliness, and family care. The famous Charmin commercials featuring Mr. Whipple became part of American cultural vocabulary, proving that even bathroom products could achieve advertising immortality. Suburban development created standardized households with standardized bathrooms, all requiring standardized products. The ranch houses sprouting across America's expanding suburbs came equipped with indoor plumbing and the expectation that toilet paper would be purchased regularly at the local supermarket. What had once been a luxury became as routine as buying milk or bread. The baby boom generation grew up never knowing a world without readily available toilet paper. For these Americans, the idea of using leaves, corn cobs, or catalogue pages seemed as foreign as using stone tools or cooking over open fires. Toilet paper wasn't just a product, it was a birthright of modern civilization. International expansion brought American toilet paper companies into contact with different cultural attitudes toward personal hygiene. In Europe, Where bidet use was more common, toilet paper served a different function than in America. In developing countries where traditional methods still prevailed, American companies had to navigate complex cultural and economic factors to establish markets. The environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s began to question the ecological impact of disposable paper products. Critics pointed out that toilet paper represented a massive consumption of trees and water for a product that was used once and discarded. Some advocates promoted bidets and reusable cloth systems as more sustainable alternatives. But by this time, toilet paper had become so deeply embedded in American culture that environmental concerns, while genuine, couldn't overcome decades of habit and expectation. Manufacturers responded by developing recycled paper products and more efficient production processes, but the fundamental model of disposable paper remained unchanged. The rise of premium toilet paper brands in the 1980s and 90s reflected America's growing affluence and willingness to pay for comfort. Products like Cottonelle and Angel Soft promised spa-like experiences in ordinary bathrooms. 3-ply thickness, lotion-infused sheets, and decorative packaging transformed a utilitarian necessity into something approaching luxury. The development of industrial-strength toilet paper for commercial use created entirely separate product lines optimized for high-traffic public restrooms. These products balanced cost, durability, and basic functionality, acknowledging that public facilities had different requirements than private homes. The internet age brought new challenges and opportunities to the toilet paper industry. Online retailers could offer bulk purchasing and home delivery, appealing to busy families who preferred not to carry bulky packages home from the store. Subscription services emerged, promising to deliver toilet paper automatically before households ran out. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 revealed just how essential toilet paper had become to modern life. Panic buying stripped store shelves bare, creating shortages that hadn't been seen since World War II rationing. The crisis demonstrated that toilet paper wasn't just a convenience, but a cornerstone of psychological security in uncertain times. Today, as we stand in our modern bathrooms reaching for rolls of soft white paper, we're participating in a ritual that would be completely alien to our ancestors just a few generations ago. The journey from sponge sticks and corn cobs to triple-ply luxury represents more than technological progress. It reflects fundamental changes in how we think about privacy, cleanliness, comfort, and what constitutes a dignified life. The story of toilet paper is ultimately the story of human adaptation and ingenuity. Faced with a universal need, our species developed countless creative solutions, each reflecting the resources, values, and possibilities of its time and place. The soft roll hanging in your bathroom isn't the end of this story, just the latest chapter in humanity's ongoing relationship with comfort, cleanliness, and the endless quest to make life a little bit better, one small innovation at a time. So the next time you reach for that soft, perforated roll hanging beside your toilet, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable journey that brought it there. From Roman sponge sticks to medieval moss, from corn cobs to catalogue pages, from Gaiety's medicated paper to today's triple-ply luxury, you're participating in a story that spans millennia and touches every culture on Earth. What seems like the most mundane of modern conveniences is actually the latest chapter in humanity's endless quest for the comfort, dignity, and just a little bit more civilization in our daily lives. Our ancestors would be amazed by what we take for granted, and perhaps that's worth remembering the next time we complain about running out of toilet paper.